Welcome to the assignment on geography, history, and culture of the developing world. In this presentation, we will examine why some regions of the world possessed certain advantages over other areas, advantages that would eventually enable their cultures to dominate politically, economically, culturally, ideologically, many of the other nations that were conquered. Virtually all of the cultures that we will study this semester were profoundly impacted by the effects that we're going to talk about in this presentation. So it's important to understand these concepts to better understand why the developing world is the way that it is. It has much more to do with natural resources than you might suspect. All right, well, this concept of globalization, this is a word we will toss about quite casually throughout the semester, and it's important that you understand what it means. We're all familiar with the term in varying ways, but let's keep in mind that just a generic way to define this concept is that this is a cultural, political, and economic interaction spanning or transcending national borders, moving to a global community, for better or for worse. So these processes and forces we now refer to conveniently as globalization have been millennia in the making, from hunter-gatherers interacting through the Persian empires, the Greek empires, the Roman, Mughal, Indian, Inca, Aztec, and Mongol empires, etc., up to the present. But perhaps the greatest impact when studying the effects of globalization has been in the last 450 years or so, when Europeans, specifically the Portuguese, and then the Spanish under Columbus, and then the Dutch and the French and the British, and the Germans and the Italians, and yes, even the Americans on occasion, all began expansionist efforts of exploration, exploitation, conquest, and colonization. So why Europe? Why the European conquest of the world? Why not the Chinese or the Aztecs or the Inca or the Ottoman empires? There are a few key factors we need to remember as to why it was the Europeans that conquered the world in this era. In contrast to Europe, China, the Ottoman Empire, the Aztec Empire, these were all quite sophisticated. Not that European culture was not sophisticated, but they had far better standards of living in these other areas, better crops typically, better weather, better nutrition, therefore, better climate, and generally a higher quality of life and health than what the Europeans enjoyed. That may play a factor in why the Europeans were so successful at expansionist efforts and why the other empires tended to contract in response to the European expansion. So this question, why Europe conquered the world and not the other empires conquering Europe or the world, is posed by Professor Jared Diamond. He is a professor of geography at UCLA in Los Angeles. His Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, puts forth a compelling argument. And in Guns, Germs, and Steel, Diamond recalls being asked by a native of Papua New Guinea, where a professor has done extensive research, why do your people have so much cargo and ours so little? So listen to this video, take a look, and this will lay the groundwork for much of what we are to study hereafter.
There are some who think Jared Diamond's argument is too neat and easy. Can the distribution of wealth and power really be reduced to cattle and wheat? What about culture, politics, and religion? Surely they've been just as important. Diamond's been criticized for being too deterministic, for ignoring the part people have played in shaping their own destiny.
My years in New Guinea have convinced me that people around the world are fundamentally similar. Wherever you go, you can find people who are smart, resourceful, and dynamic. No society has a monopoly on those traits. Of course, there are huge cultural differences, but they're mainly the result of inequality, they're not its root cause. Ultimately, what's far more important is the hand that people have been dealt, the raw materials they've had at their disposal. New Guineans acquired pigs from Eurasia, but not cows or sheep or goats or horses or wheat or barley. They didn't develop in the same way as Europeans and Americans because they didn't have the same raw materials. I'm not saying that those divisions of the world are set in stone and can't be changed. It's quite the opposite. The towns of Papua New Guinea are becoming bigger and more developed, populated by modern New Guineans trying to catch up with the rest of the world. Unfortunately for them, there's still a big gap to overcome.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
Yali caught me by surprise 30 years ago. I had no idea what to say to him then, but now I think I know the answer. Yali, it wasn't for lack of ingenuity that your people didn't end up with modern technology. They had the ingenuity to master these difficult New Guinea environments. Instead, the whole answer to your question was geography. If your people had enjoyed the same geographic advantages as my people, your people would have been the ones to invent helicopters.
Jared Diamond set out to explore the division of the world into haves and have-nots. He's convinced the blueprint for that division lies within the land itself. But can his way of seeing the world really shed light on the turning points of human history? Can it explain how a few hundred Europeans conquered the New World and began an age of domination? The age of guns, germs, and steel.
Well, if I were a betting man living in the year 1400 or so, I would have bet my money on the Chinese poised to take over the world rather than the Europeans. In the early 1400s, Europe was still suffering from a number of setbacks, both biological in the form of the infamous Black Death, ideological in the form of the Great Western Schism, and politically in the form of the 100 Years' War. A very fractionalized society was Europe compared to China, which was politically united, culturally sophisticated, economically powerful, and generally just way ahead of Europe. Thriving under the Ming Dynasty, China was poised to rule the world. But the Chinese in general seemed to lack the one thing Europeans had in abundance: the willingness to take risks due to desperation and hunger. So the Ming exploration before Columbus in 1421 fully, 71 years before Columbus sails the ocean blue, we will see the Ming Empire with Emperor Zhu Di send out a colossal naval fleet, years in the making, to explore the world, known and unknown. This expedition was led by the famous Chinese Admiral Zheng He. These Chinese ships, they're called junks, dwarfed the Portuguese and Spanish fleets of a few decades later. If you take a look at the illustration on the bottom right, the Chinese ship in comparison to the European ship. Chinese ship could carry roughly 1,500 crew, a large one, whereas the European ships could carry 250, maybe 300 at the most. So this is really a good indicator of Chinese superiority during the time. Zheng He's fleet sailed throughout the Indian Ocean. Some historians speculate he made it into the Pacific Ocean. Remember, this is fully 70 years before Columbus and nearly 100 before Magellan's fleet will circumnavigate the globe. The Chinese fleet picks up tribute from the civilizations they encounter. And the fleet returned a couple of years later to the emperor with its many souvenirs from its exotic travels, presented them before the emperor, who, upon close inspection of the trinkets, concluded that the things produced outside of China were of vastly inferior quality. True, absolutely true. Craftsmanship in China was superior to that of any other part of the world at the time. What's surprising, I think, is the ideas that flow from this. The emperor will order the destruction of the fleet. He burns it. All the records of this expedition destroyed, and he will prohibit any further expeditions. Now, why? Well, this general attitude, maybe of overconfidence, a superiority complex, and perhaps hyper-conservatism. The Chinese tendency during this period would be to look to the past greatness to solve its problems, not to the future to address the needs of the Ming Empire's situation. We can compare this with the Ottomans as well. They will do the same thing. They will be superior to European cultures in sophistication, in political unity, in religious unity, and yet at the same time they will consider themselves superior to such a degree that they're not willing to change, they're not willing to experiment, adapt, and evolve. Well, this European desperation we've talked about briefly. So just as China became no longer interested in other cultures, just as the Chinese became less curious about the world around them, just as China began to look inward to its past greatness, its superiority, its incredible accomplishments, Europe was just starting to open up to the rest of the world. And we see the age of exploration just on the verge of exploding. This was really motivated by necessity and desperation, the Black Death, the 100 Years' War, political disunity. So Portuguese sailors begin sailing down the coast of West Africa in the 1450s in search of new trade routes, new trading partners in West Africa and later in East Africa, where they will encounter the Arab spice trades, the Swahili city-states of East Africa. And this ambition by the Europeans really was in response to increasing demand. The European appetite for spiced foods had been whetted from the Crusades onward. The Portuguese were also responding to increased control of the spice trade from the Ottomans and the Arab merchants who controlled the vast majority of these commodities and routes. Okay, so we will see the theories of a sea route to India come out of this. And the Columbian Exchange. So when Columbus attempts to sail west to go east, everything changes. The world turns out to be much bigger than most people believed than all people believed. So this Columbian exchange, we will see a vast land grab, the fruits, the vegetables, the incredible bounty that comes from the New World is also associated with this age of conquest. Potatoes, squashes, tomatoes, corn, certainly, all become major commodities in Europe. We also see rampant disease on the American continents. Smallpox and influenza will wipe out entire civilizations over the subsequent centuries, and the slave trade will ensue. So, why was Europe poised to conquer much of the world? We've discussed a few of these advantages. We'll discuss some of the geographical advantages here shortly, but just let's take a look at these maps. On the left, we see the British and French empires at their heights. On the right, Spanish and Portuguese empires, German Empire as well. And this really ends up becoming a large part of the global land masses. Virtually all of North and South America were colonized. All of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, were colonized. And significant portions of Asia, India obviously being probably the most important there, but the Spice Islands. The only places that were immune to European intervention was obviously China and much of Central Asia, which will eventually get gobbled up as well by much of the British interests. All right, so the east-west axis, well, pure geology and geography play a major part in European capacity to dominate. And not only Europe, but Asia in general. As we've seen how China reacts to change, Europe will take a very different tack on that. Eurasia is on an east-west axis. This is absolutely crucial. It's much more significant than it might appear at first glance. An east-west axis is more conducive to trade than a north-south axis. We have similar climates, similar crops. When it's summer in Rome, it is summer in Beijing and all the other cities along the way. This makes trade much easier. Traveling during the same seasons and within generally the same climate, yes, altitudes change, there are mountains, there are deserts, but it's still the same season at least, is a significant advantage to north-south travel, where one must not only traverse differing terrains, but seasons also. So when it's summer in Toronto, it is not summer in Santiago, Chile, is it? It is winter. Okay, so this is pretty important. Furthermore, trade and the flow of goods is a catalyst to innovation, ideas, religions, politics, technologies, intermarriage, the intermingling of culture. So generally speaking, a horse-drawn carriage traveling east-west does not need to cross radically different climates, whereas one traveling long distances north-south does. Anyone tried to push a wheelbarrow in the sand or in a tropical jungle. It's no wonder why sub-Saharan Africa or Central America never adopted the wheel, not through lack of intelligence, but simply through difficulty of application. So you can see how some of these ideas spread east-west, and the ideas ended up creating a more advanced civilization.
Yet for all its advantages, the Fertile Crescent is not the powerhouse of the modern world, nor is it the breadbasket it once was. How did it lose its head start? Within 1,000 years of their emergence, most of the new villages of the Fertile Crescent were abandoned. Ironically, the region had a fundamental weakness. Despite having some of the most nutritious crops on the planet, its climate was too dry and its ecology too fragile to support continuous intensive farming.
People were destroying the environment. The waters had been overexploited, the trees had been cut, and this is what, when you face a dead end, I mean, you are facing a wall. You will end with landscape like that. I mean, with few trees, with no grass, and with less water. So what we are looking at today is the outcome of overexploiting the environment.
Unable to farm their land, entire communities were forced to move on. The advantages they'd accrued from centuries of domestication might have been lost. But again, geography was on their side.
The Fertile Crescent is in the middle of a huge landmass, Eurasia. There were plenty of places for farming to spread, and crucially, many of those places were to the east and west of the Fertile Crescent at roughly the same line of latitude. Why is that so important? Because any 2 points of the globe that share the same latitude automatically share the same length of day, and they often share a similar climate and vegetation. Crops or animals domesticated in the Fertile Crescent were able to prosper at other places along the east-west axis of Eurasia. Wheat and barley, sheep and goats, cows and pigs all spread from the Fertile Crescent, east towards India and west towards North Africa and Europe. Wherever they went, they transformed human societies.
Once the crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent reached Egypt, they caused an explosion of civilization. Suddenly, there was enough food to feed the pharaohs and generals, the engineers and scribes, and the armies of people required to build the pyramids. The same is true of European civilization. From ancient times until the Renaissance, the crops and animals of the Fertile Crescent fed the artists, inventors, and soldiers of Europe. In the 16th century, the same crops and animals were taken by Europeans to the New World. At the time, there was not a single cow or ear of wheat in all the Americas. Now there are 100 million cattle in the U.S. alone. And Americans consume 20 million tons of wheat a year. Modern, industrialized America would be unthinkable without the spread of farming from the Fertile Crescent.
So, following this train of thought of the advantages Eurasia had to development and technology, let's name some of the animals that have been domesticated since civilization began 6, 7, 8,000, 10,000 years ago. The cow, Eurasian. The sheep, or the pig, or the goat, all from Asia. The horse, Eurasia. The camel, not African, Asian. The ox, Asia. So let's name some of these, the indigenous animals. All of these are domesticated. All of these provided food, obviously. They provided clothing. They provided transportation and power. They pulled plows, wagons, and things like that. So uniquely and exclusively privy or indigenous to Asia and Europe. Quite significant here for the development of civilizations and complex societies. Africa, well, there's lots and lots of big animals in Africa. One would think that it would be easy to domesticate some of these larger animals, but believe it or not, there are dozens of animals that are seemingly domesticable, but they are not. Like the lion. Well, who wants to domesticate a lion? The zebra, perfect example. But it has never been domesticated until recently, and that's really just in captivity for zoos. Nobody rides zebras. They're too flighty. They just don't obey. They scare easily, and they bite, and they're mean. The giraffe, not domesticated. Hyena, well, who would want to? The wildebeest, not domesticated. None of these animals were ever harnessed for their power, for their capacity to pull a plow, etc. The gazelle, no. The impala, no. The hippo, no. So Africa, despite its vast animal resources, was at a distinct disadvantage when it came to exploiting those resources compared to Europe and Asia. Well, not even the mighty gorilla. Let's take a look at Latin America. Well, we have the llama, which was domesticated, and we have the turkey, which was domesticated. The bear, no. Elk, no. Moose, no. Other large animals, the jaguar, no. Deer, no. So large animals in abundance in North and South America, but the muskox, no. But no domestication with the exception of these two. And we will get back to the llama here shortly. So animals and development. What's the relationship between domestication of animals and development? Well, this is obvious. Food, clothing, transport, power. Obviously, these are crucial for development. They pull plows. They rotate around grain mills to crush the grain to make it into flour, etc. Why do you think they call it horsepower? For heaven's sake, it's because of the power of the horse. Well, the diseases is something that perhaps we have not taken a close enough look at. The reciprocity here between animals and disease is an equally important aspect of domestication of animals in Europe and Asia that led to its development faster than other continents. One that might not be so obvious, and that is microbes. The millennia-long close proximity of people with their animals. Let's remember this is long before antibiotics, immunizations, commercial farming with the hormone injections and things like that. People in the temperate climates of Europe and Asia pastured their animals in the warmer months. When it got really cold, they brought them into their huts or houses and lived with them to survive the winter. The peasants got sick, the animals got sick, everybody got sick, and these microbes exchanged hosts. We see this reciprocal relationship between microbe, between carrier, between animals and humans. Smallpox, influenza, these two great killers of the Amerindians in the New World at Columbus's arrival, were completely unknown diseases for which the Amerindians had no immunities because they did not raise animals associated with those diseases. So this is a millennia-long battle for survival between man and microbes, still going on today. We've had a recent scare with the swine flu, which is evidently a mutation of a naturally occurring disease in pigs. And we know the smallpox and influenza viruses proved deadly to many, many millions of Native Americans. So the Eurasian domestication of animals offers resistance to European settlers in the Americas. Well, so what about the llama? Well, the llama, although domesticated by the Inca, was not brought in during the winter. It grazes out in the cold. The llama's warm coat, the reason for the domestication in the first place, made it so they could survive the harsh Andes winters. Thus the Inca, the Aztec, the remaining Maya, and all other Native Americans were at a real disadvantage, microbially speaking. In addition to the technologies Europeans invented, or more often borrowed and adapted, such as gunpowder, one good sneeze could do much more damage than an entire fleet of conquistadors. Well, I guess so what? So what is the question we pose now? Well, geography certainly played a key role. East-west trade routes, these gave the Europeans access to information and new technologies such as the printing press, gunpowder, etc. The wide variety of domesticated animals, all indigenous to Europe and Asia, enabled European explorers to be resistant to diseases to which the Amerindians were not. And once the New World was discovered by Europeans, and considering the advantages the Europeans held with regards to technological developments, this globalizing process we will be studying for the next several weeks in this semester rapidly accelerated. New markets, as well as new lands, opened up. What was once a relatively slow-moving process involving trade goods, trading ideas with commerce, became an ever-accelerating process of Europeanization worldwide, leading to the slave era, the colonial era, the independence era, and today, the global economy. And that is what we will be discussing in this class.